Thank you, Antonio, for the very nice invitation. Thank you all for attending. And today I'm going to talk about the recent advances in machine learning for Earth observation, as you can tell from the title. And there you will see a lot of methods, a lot of methodologies that we have been developing over the last years. Let me first start with a very brief overview of the scenario that we're going to work with. Of course, as you can tell from the title, this will involve either, well, both machine learning, but also taking into account the particular characteristics and challenges in the Earth system science. Okay, so it goes without saying that the Earth is a very highly complex and dynamic and network system. And in the last few hundred years, the human activities have precipitated enormous changes in the system. Nowadays, perhaps one of the most important challenges that we as scientists and engineers are facing is that of both quantifying and also understanding the processes occurring on the Earth. Quantitative and qualitative assessment and modeling has a great impact. And assessing how this system, this little Earth, is evolving may have very important societal, environmental, and economical implications. In particular, now with this growing demand of biofuels and food, we want to do inferences about the system. And for that, we will use Earth observation data and automatic machine learning algorithms. Well, this is the formal definition of Earth observation, the definition that you will be able to find in whatever textbook. So Earth observation is the gathering of information about the planet Earth's physical, chemical, and biological system via remote sensing technologies, also helped, aided by Earth surveying techniques encompassing the collection, the analysis, and the presentation of the data. You can tell from this definition that you will have two important concepts. One is data, and the other is information. These two concepts are linked, are related, but they are not synonyms, okay? So we will try to extract information out of the data analysis process. So the point is that we have now hundreds, if not thousands of satellites above our heads, capturing all kinds of images at all kinds of spatial, temporal, and spectral resolutions. And here you see a very simple schematic of this concept of spectroscopy, by which we have sensors that can be either airborne or satellite ones that acquire a spatial, explicit, but also temporally resolved information. So we have a repetitive time of acquisition, and this information is gathered at a wide range of spectral channels. Basically, the sensor uses the sun as the illumination source and acquires the reflected energy from the land cover or the objects that it encounters, of course, the land, the water bodies, and also, of course, the atmosphere that it is in the middle. This information is very rich, I mean, spatially, temporally, and spectrally, and allow us to tackle a lot of multiple and a myriad, actually, of monitoring problems. So in a nutshell, Earth observation mainly serves two big purposes. The first one is classification, and the second one is regression. These are two concepts that are ubiquitous in the machine learning literature. These are like the two standard paradigms of learning, right? Classifiers and regressors. We either may want, on the one hand, to detect or classify objects and changes, that's classification, or rather we are interested in real quantities, and we aim then to estimate parameters describing the physical properties of the objects that we are observing, like the temperature or the vegetation status on health. For tackling all these challenges, remote sensing and Earth observation in particular has met some colleagues in the last decade. Nowadays, nothing is actually possible without the contributions from many fields, as you can see here in this slide, from physics, ecology, and biology. And for that, we need engineers and mathematicians. And it goes without saying that remote sensing has received many contributions from computer vision and image processing, also, of course, from signal processing. But nowadays, if I should summarize in a nutshell which one is the most predominant contributor? That's machine learning. And that's one of the topics that brings me here. So what has happened in the last decade? Why machine learning is important in this arena, in remote sensing or Earth observation? Well, machine learning is about designing algorithms that find patterns in the data. But it shouldn't be just that. I mean, that's like the official definition. I prefer to see machine learning as learning through machines. I mean, applying machine modeling and try to discover new patterns and develop modeling for understanding how the system, how the Earth is behaving, how the system evolves and works. So, okay, let's go for a more formal definition of machine learning. Well, this is the very naive definition of machine learning. By the way, this is the only formula that I will put in the presentation, in the whole presentation. In machine learning, we often want to learn a function f that learns from observations x and tries to approximate well this target variable y. An important point here is that f is not prescribed. I mean, it is not defined a priori beforehand. It is normally a nonlinear, non-parametric, flexible function. And what it is, I think, very important and distinctive here is that this function f is learned from data only. Well, this is like the formal definition of machine learning. That's what I said. But this definition has changed in the last few years. You will see in a second what I'm talking about. Well, it goes without saying that you can tell from the newspapers and the TV that machine learning is revolutionizing the way we do science, right? And in particular, when you talk about deep learning, it's advancing the field of Earth observation dramatically in the last decade. These techniques allow us to solve challenging problems like classification and regression and anomaly detection with an unprecedented accuracy. And yes, they scale, they tend to scale very well with tons of examples, with tons and tons of data points. The point now that I want to raise is that advances are so many and applications are so exciting, actually, that people have even advocated that AI, relying only on big data, is replacing science and education at some extent, the way we do investigation, the way we do science. Well, implicitly, this philosophy assumes that when enough data is observed, there is no need to understand the laws of physics. And actually, this is an opinion and one of the reasons why that I'm not really agree with. You will see in a second why. The point is that, this is my observation, is that deep learning in particular, or machine learning in general, their success is not incidental. Deep learning works very, very well in this kind of perfect storm. We need data that exhibits some regularities, either spatial or temporal strong correlations, like in video or image or time series analysis or speech recognition, for instance. In both data modalities, you will always observe a strong autocorrelation function. Well, the second point is that it typically works, it is very successful indeed when big data is readily accessible, when one has huge computational resources available and very fast and scalable models. Well, that's the second reason why it worked, because of the popularization and even democratization of machine learning source code, right? And the last but not least, in 90% of the applications that you observe, automatic machine learning is desired. I mean, practitioners are seldom scientists. They just want to apply something that works reasonably well, it achieves a recent accuracy level, and that's all. They just want to reach that accuracy level with a minimum effort, without, if it is possible, without even integrating domain knowledge or prior knowledge. This is the aim. And this is actually this perfect storm that has made successful the deep learning architectures and models. But now the question is if our little nice object called Earth has all these ingredients. Let's briefly review the main challenges. And actually, I split it, the main challenges that we are observing in Earth observation, in 3 different families. So the first family is about the big data issue. Well, Earth observation problems are naturally framed in these big data challenges. We are aware of the 4 Bs, right? We have a big data problem is declared big data problem if you have high volume, high velocity, high variety, and high veracity. But we should not forget about the 5th B, that it is typically not mentioned at all in all the discussions and all the developments. The 5B is the value. In Earth observation applications, of course, we have hundreds of petabytes to process, and the growing is quasi-exponential. It is also very important to know that the growing is roughly about 5 petabytes a year. Now it is almost 20 petabytes a year and increasing. Reprocessing and versioning are common challenges again, so a lot of diversity and variety of multidimensional spatial integration of different sources of information of data from a very detailed organ level, such as leaves, to a global scale level. So we are actually mixing a lot of data sources, and a lot of diversity is involved. And Earth has diverse observational systems too. So we are observing the Earth, and the process is occurring on the Earth with different sensors of different spatial-temporal, spectral resolution, and also in different situations. So uncertainty is involved here. But what happens with the V? What happens with the value that we can actually get from all this data? Can we actually extract information, not just analyze data? That's the first family of challenges. The second one is the statistical challenges. So I'm not a computer scientist, but a physicist by training. So I really care about the mathematical and statistical properties of the objects I work with. There are some challenges that Earth observation data is introducing here, which in my view are more exciting, more interesting. Not the big data thing that at the end you put computers on the table and they will solve the problem for you. We often have to deal with multivariate, multidimensional data, either because of the combination of different sensors or because the structure of the manifold where the data is embedded into. Relations between features often exhibit like nonlinear feature relations and non-Gaussian distributions. So this makes the problem more complicated. And these statistics actually give rise to data misalignments and distortions. So even if you observe a particular area, the day after, the statistics, the distribution of the data that you are acquiring will differ slightly at least. So these misfits are very difficult to process with an automatic machine learning model. And at the same time, we are often facing the challenges of including irrelevant features and noisy features. So we have to pick up the most important features in order to develop our models, right? And of course, we have uneven distributions, all kind of anomalies, and all kind of noise sources. And finally, if it was not enough with all that, we want to learn a machine learning model with typically few labeled examples. And then we want and we pretend that this model will extrapolate to unseen data. And that's a big challenge, ladies and gentlemen. Last but not least, I think that the most important challenge, or the most important family of challenges, is what I named the philosophical challenges. What do I mean by that? Well, the vast majority of machine learning models do not respect the most elementary laws of physics. So like the mass or energy conservation, they are just fitting algorithms. And this is actually really annoying. Also, it has been argued that machine learning models just fit. They excel into that. There's no doubt about it. They reach high accuracy levels, but in the end, they are like black boxes. So nothing fundamental is learned in the end. No new law of physics is learned from a deep learning model. Actually, these models are actually becoming so big and so complicated with so many hyperparameters tuned there that interpretability is often compromised. And finally, the third point that I want to raise is that while these methods undoubtedly capture some sense out of the data, how could we know that they actually capture something about what we call causation, the cause and effect relationships? So imagine that you have a deep learning model and the same results in accuracy terms will be attained if you confuse the input with the outputs, if you reverse the problem. So nothing is actually understood by the model, right? Well, with all these challenges in mind, this is the menu for this afternoon. I will try to revise maybe not 30, but 20 something methods, new methods that we have been developing in the last years to cope with all these particular observations, these problems. So trying to respect the data structure and the features, characteristics, remember, non-linearities, non-Gaussianity, also work, of course, with millions of data points in the cloud. And then third, and more interestingly, respect the laws of physics and trying to understand the model and infer, if possible, fundamental laws by data analysis with machine learning, okay? Okay, so let's breathe a little bit and let's start, okay? Okay, so let me start with machine learning models that respect the spatial and temporal structure of data. I will introduce methods for doing classification, regression, and dimensionality reduction. Well, and let's start with classification first. Well, in current times, exploiting temporal and spatial correlation is best done with neural networks. What we call deep learning, or more specifically, a method called convolutional neural networks. These ConvNets models exploit the spatial redundancy in the image. Okay. And how do they do that? Well, basically by learning some optimal filters of the image plane, optimal in the sense that the resulting features that they extract are very discriminative. So they are useful for discriminating between classes. But now what happens with time? Well, dealing with the information in time is actually typically done with recurrent neural networks that capture memory and temporal redundancies very efficiently. In this example, the combination of convolutional neural networks and recurrent neural networks that account for both space and time have provided excellent results for detecting classes of interest. And in particular, we have been using this quite a lot for detecting clouds from multispectral imagery, but also for following up crops and crop development and production, and also for detecting changes. That can be also a particular application. Well, even when space and time are considered together, the vicinity that the models look at, it is quite limited. I mean, you cannot allow a super huge receptive field and train all that massive filter with a limited number of points. On the one hand, convolutions and memory units are by construction filters, right? Filters with finite impulsive response functions. And on the other hand, recurrent and LSTM networks cannot remember longer sequences. So memory and what we call persistence of processes is not optimally accounted for. Well, nowadays, several architectures have been proposed to tackle this kind of, let's say, myopic problem of neural networks. And these are called attention deep learning networks. A promising architecture tries to combine standard ConvNets with human attention mechanisms in neuroscience. So these are the cold attention networks, and they can look at the information in distant regions, driving processes and activations in a local window. This is very important, for instance, to tackle the problem in climate science of accounting for teleconnections between the planet regions. So what happens here in the Western Pacific, it is actually impacting the Mediterranean Sea. So these long distance processes connections, they have to be tackled somehow, and these networks can do a decent job in that. Well, there is another type of architectures that now are very popular in earth sciences. One typically acquires and works with sparse, typically discontinuous, and not necessarily stationary data. So these particularities call for models able to work in non-Euclidean domains, and deep learning defined over graphs or manifolds is complicated, mainly because the non-Euclidean nature of the data distributions, right? And that makes these operations, the basic operations of deep learning, like convolution or filtering, rather complicated and elusive. So here, geometric deep learning extends these deep learning operations over graphs and has given rise to convolutional or recurrent networks over graphs, which opens a wide range of applications in Earth observation to deal with sparse sensory networks or uneven sample time series, for example. Well, so far so good, but there is one thing to mention. A pure discriminative approach like neural networks cannot tell us anything about the posterior probability of the decision. Of course, there are tricks and hacks that you can apply here, but there are more recent and more fundamental ways to do that and more proper mathematical grounded ways. This is the field of probabilistic models, and in this arena, Gaussian processes, and of course, deep Gaussian processes can say a word in here in order to treat uncertainty well. Well, this probabilistic treatment of the classification problems gives some advantages. So GPs, Gaussian processes, provide confidence intervals for the predictions, but also additional advantages, like ranking of the most important features that can be interesting in order to understand something about the problem. And currently, they are quite efficient computationally too. Actually, GPs have gone deep, as I said, and the field of variational inference allows running these methods in reasonable times for a moderate number of points or examples. And lastly, I would like to mention in the classification arena that in remote sensing data processing, we are confronted with problems of heterogeneity of the data. Data acquired by different groups, sensors, and situations pose a big data processing problem. Should one just include everything in just one big database and then use your favorite algorithm? Or rather, can we develop methods that learn the interrelationships between the individual data sets? Well, this is the field of multitask learning, or sometimes referred also as a kind of domain adaptation problem. Here, the algorithm learns the implicit relationships between the features of the different observational sets that you have been acquiring, and combines them all in an optimal way for doing classification. Well, interestingly here, multitask learning allows first to train a model in one situation and being easily or relatively easily adapted to another slightly different situation. And second point, that allows you also to learn the graph that relates this particular different tasks involved in the problem, right? Okay, so let me jump now to my favorite scenario, that of regression and function approximation. Actually, in remote sensing, we call this field parameter retrieval, right? So we want to retrieve some parameters of the process that is occurring in land, water, or the atmosphere. And I will basically revise like three main families. Well, first of all, some kind of cool applications. Machine learning is now able to generate what we call products. And these are basically maps of useful information, and they are derived of the satellite or airborne imagery. For example, neural networks are now vastly applied to create and update land use and land cover maps, as this particular company does, like One Soil Maps. Also, Digital Globe, now Maxer, is a company that trained a neural network and along with very high resolution imagery and census data, and they were able to predict the wealth and poverty of a particular neighborhood in some cities. And there are many different applications, and most of them are reduced to a statistical regression problem, so where X and Y are real and continuous variables. Well, how things work in real practice here in this field? Well, when the target variable is a real variable, as I said, we are in a regression setting. Let me briefly review how things are done here. So in this case, we conducted a terrestrial campaign and took samples, measurements of a parameter called leaf area index, and also chlorophyll content was measured with a particular chlorophyll content meter. And in plants, we were interested in monitoring vegetation here. And at the same time, a satellite with a hyperspectral sensor was overpassing the area. And after many corrections, an input-output training set was finally created. And that was used for training a GP model. And with that GP model, you can apply it to every single pixel in the image that you're acquiring. And you basically derive like two interesting products. You see here like an RGB false color composite here on the left, and on the middle, you see the predictions for the chlorophyll content, and then on the right, you can derive as well, as I said before, confidence interval for the estimation for the predictions, not just a point-wise estimate of chlorophyll content, but also the error bars for these predictions. And this can be very useful to detect anomalies or to mask out irrelevant predictions or not that trustworthy predictions. Okay. But one can go global too, not just regional or at a small scale. And one can exploit data coming from flux towers, for instance, to upscale key fluxes globally. Of course, in combination with remote sensing data. In this exercise, we took data coming from eddy covariances that are basically sensors mounted on top of towers around the planet, which are very useful to estimate a wide variety of covariates or variables of interest for monitoring the Earth. So estimating turbulent exchange of CO2 between the canopy and the atmosphere, latent and sensible heat, etc. And also they are useful to estimate an important property, an important variable, the gross perimeter productivity that accounts for the carbon uptake by plants. So the network of flux towers is called FluxNet, and it is, as you can see in this map, it is unevenly distributed, mostly in the rich north hemisphere. As input data to the algorithms, we took MODIS data, which have a weekly resolution and allow us to estimate very sensible parameters like proxies to flux uptake. So we estimated like leaf area index and a bunch of greenness vegetation indices and parameters, land surface temperature over the day, over the night, etc. So we extracted features, and then these features were used for regression. We constructed this database, and then we developed a bunch of algorithms like neural networks, kernel methods, decision trees, random forests. And in the end, we perform like an ensemble of the different algorithms. Combine them all. So with a new incoming observation, we could then generate a spatial explicit maps of GPP, for instance, or from other different variables. Here in this map, it is shown 3 different maps at the same time. So latent heat, sensible heat, and radiation. And with that, you can, study like seasonality, also interdependencies, anomalies, and the limiting factors of vegetation growth, health, and status, for example. But what happens if you want to exploit in the regression setting the spatial and temporal structure as the same way that we did in classification? Well, spatial-temporal analysis is actually the commonplace in climate informatics and neuroscience and radio processing, in natural language processing, etc. In all cases, we have an object that evolves in time, and we want to do inferences about this object. For instance, estimating, characterizing, or predicting the behavior of that object, where this object will be in a certain time. Well, in remote sensing, we have the big fields of parameter retrieval, the time series gap filling, or data assimilation as the most prominent fields. And in the last decade, neural networks and Gaussian processes have, again, excelled into that. I want you to introduce 2 recent developments that we have done in the lab. The first one on the left, it is called distribution regression. Here, we do not have like pairs of input-output data pairs, but we have a bunch of input points and a distribution and an associated scalar. And this happens a lot in remote sensing. We have a lot of pixels, for instance, of a country or a region or even a parcel. And then you have associated to that particular object just a scalar, a quantity. In that particular case, we were applying this method that summarizes all the higher order relationships between the points in that bunch of data, in that bag, in that distribution, and summarize the information content there and found the exact good relation with the parameter to be retrieved here, which was crop productivity. On the second approach, the second method that we have been using quite often in the last decade, in the last years, has been the deep Gaussian processes. That essentially it is as in a deep neural network, there is a connected layer of different Gaussian processes. They are continuously hierarchically stacked, and similar tricks as those that are typically used in neural networks can be applied here. So here we again gain these particular advantages of scaling up to 100,000 or even million of data points. And at the same time, we inherit the advantages of treating the problem in a Bayesian way. So we can derive confidence intervals for the predictions and do some Bayesian inference on the problem. And now regression models can also tackle multiple outputs simultaneously. This is very powerful and computationally very convenient. And the figure on the left, I'm showing you a convolutional neural network that exploits the horizontal, but also the vertical features for estimating atmospheric parameter profiles. For instance, the temperature or the moisture or the dew or the ozone concentration at different layers in the atmosphere. And this is used, for instance, for doing studies in atmospheric chemistry. Well, interestingly, both the spatial and also the vertical features for temperature were also very useful for deploying an algorithm that could be transferred to do predictions, not for temperature, but for moisture, because the features are quite similar. So we basically train for temperature, then freeze the last layer of the convolutional neural network and retrain that for the moisture prediction, and that is super fast because you only have to compute a pseudo inverse of the problem or of the layer, right? So we gain flexibility and also reusability of the code. So that's a couple of good advantages. But multi-output regression is not only for the sake of efficiency, but also to address the problems about the physical consistency. Let me introduce this topic here. Very often we run individual models for different variables of interest, but the truth is that these variables are related and that could help machine learning data. This is the case of the Sladen-Force model Gaussian process on the left, where you can see here a hierarchical structure with common features. And this is used for predicting relative variables, like as I said before, the delivery index and the FAPR, the fraction of photoelectric active radiation, but also the relationships between different multiple sensors, the observations from different multiple sensors to estimate, for instance, soil moisture. The method can fill in the gaps of all the time series by importing information across time, across sensors, and across space too. Okay, and finally, we saw classification, we saw regression. Let me say some words about dimensionality reduction and the modes of variability as it's typically put in climate sciences. Well, what happens if you don't have labels? Well, this is this particular field. We want to extract as useful the useful features out of the data set. And these are, we want to learn a feature representation that it is useful for summarizing the data, but it is in principle useful for applying a classifier or a regression on top of those. So what happens when we want to derive a kind of nonlinear PCA that it should be sparse? What happens if when maximizing the variance, like in PCA or kernel PCA, is not enough, is not the goal? And what happens when we have spatial-temporal relationships? Okay, so in order to answer the first question, we developed a convolutional neural network that can extract discriminative features in a purely unsupervised way. So it is parameter-free. The criterions used here is to maximize sparsity of the representation. So the results of the network are really outstanding, not only in accuracy, when you put a classifier on top of the feature representation, but also because it is really useful for visualizing, for clustering, for finding common clusters and groups. And also it runs very fast. It is very efficient, computationally speaking. Well, when maximizing variance is not appropriate, one can resort to other methods from the field of multivariate data analysis. That it is a very old field, statistics, and you may find there the partial least squares, the orthonormalized version, or the canonical correlation analysis. And these methods optimize other criteria other than variance, like they maximize correlation or covariance. For all of them, there are no nonlinear kernel versions, okay? And also, there are kernel versions that allow you to extract features that are optimal under another criterion, like the signal-to-noise ratio. So you can extract features that are following the higher variance dimensions and also trying to avoid the higher noise dimensions. So that's a great opportunity to extract useful features in the end. But also you can optimize the feature structure in order to extract features according to a common concept in information theory called entropy. Actually, I should mention here that with some algebra tricks, now kernel methods can be scaled very efficiently to work with millions of data points too. So there is no more shortcomings on that side. Well, and the third point goes along this dual dimension, right? We typically work with cubes, with the spatial-temporal cubes, or with the spatial spectral cubes, right? In remote sensing and Earth observation. So it goes without saying that PCA is perhaps the most effective method here for reducing the dimensionality. Nobody doubts that. But it has like two important caveats. So one is that it cannot cope with nonlinearities. And then the second one is, how can we deal with these particular spatial-temporal redundancies? Well, recently, we proposed a nonlinear spatial and temporal extension of PCA such that we can decompose these cubes into both space features and time modes of variability, time features, right? And this can be very useful because this way you can identify which are the modes of variability in time, which are the principal frequencies, let's say, and also spatially explicit linked in the spatial maps that we derive, right? And you can retrieve a particular variance, a particular relevance for each one of them. Well, when we further applied to decompose soil moisture, for instance, soil moisture cubes, sensible compression was attained, and we observed some models of variability that were actually related to climate-specific classes, as you can see here in these maps. There were some temporal components very nicely related to El Niño, for instance, in the third temporal component extracted. And actually looking at that particular third PCA, principal component, we not only found high correlations with El Niño event, but also unreported patterns for wetness and dryness. A simple cross-correlation analysis with the extracted features also uncover these lags. So you can start thinking about what are the generating process undergoing, right? And to account for, and derive like a kind of several indices that can be useful for explaining out things. Okay, and now let me talk a bit about efficiency in this big data era. Well, to be honest, I'm not an expert on that, but I can tell you about a friend that knows very well this field. And yes, you guessed it right. It's Google, and in particular, the Google Earth Engine is one of these facilities of this programming infrastructures that are very useful to derive or to deploy machine learning or particular data processing techniques in the wild with a lot of data from Earth observation. So we actually love it because it allows you to do two very nice things. The first one, it allows you to focus on the algorithm only and the application, and not on the optimization and the data gathering, etc. All the data is there. And that's the second point. By the way, it is at this point, it is much easier to use Landsat than Sentinels, and that's a reason, I mean, directly in the Google Earth Engine, other than going to the same to have infrastructure. We have recently developed 3 cool applications here with Google Earth Engine. The first application is just for fun. So we did cloud classification in the cloud. It is just a joke. For that, we used the Google Earth Engine capabilities to exploit the temporal information. Remember clouds, if you want to classify clouds, one could think of, okay, clouds are white, clouds are bright, and clouds are about the surface. And these are the typical features that one can derive from remote sensing imagery. But we thought, okay, but clouds also move, right? So we wanted to exploit both the spatial features and the temporal, and that's what we did here. We applied what we call a chronochrome approximation, in which we predict the next step, the next image, and what it stands out, it can be either an anomaly or a cloud, right? And along with other features that are discriminating between anomalous changes and clouds, we were able to describe the background, and then the error could be pretty much associated to changes or to clouds. Well, the second approximation, the second thing that we have been doing is what happens if you don't have data, if you don't have labeled data. But maybe you have models. In this work, we took a vegetation model in home, ran it, generated simulations with all kinds of parameterizations, trained a random forest to invert that particular reality transfer model, and then implemented it in the Google Earth Engine. And with the proposed methodology, this is a particular paper that shows for the first time the canopy water content variety globally, because it was not available so far, because there were not actually in situ data enough for training a particular machine learning model that scales well this quantity. So we could do it with an RTM, inverting that and implemented in Google Earth Engine. And the third one is what happens if you do have data, but this data is pretty sparse. And this is the case, for instance, of plant traits, properties or particular properties of plants. And you have this huge database that it is called TRI. And after a very complex process of, involving many random forests, remote sensing climatic data, we generated global maps of plant traits, like the nitrogen or phosphorus rates. And they actually may have some impact in ecology, in agriculture, and ecosystems modeling too. Okay, so far so good, but I'm not really fine with what we have seen so far, essentially because the models are blind to what are the rules, what are the laws of physics. So note that, as I said before, this function f is learned from data and only from data, but this is true until now. In recent years, there is a high interest in combining purely data-driven machine learning models with physics laws and constraints. You can see this cartoon here. The gains are multiple: consistency, sufficiency, and speed. Let's see how it goes with all that. And there is a lot of interest nowadays, actually. The truth is that you can see here in this slide that this is a photo I captured in the AGU conference the first time I attended. And that was one of my first talks attending. And it kind of struck me quite a bit. Models without data are fantasy. Data without models are chaos, or kind of. No? Well, this is the arena. So we want to combine both. We want to combine data-driven approaches with all the well-known theory and mechanistic modeling that we have in the literature of physics. When I mean physics, you can think of chemistry or biology processes, etc. Whatever we have as a domain knowledge can be now incorporated in machine learning algorithms. Okay, some examples, how we typically do this. So the first approach to combine physical laws with is through a kind of constraint optimization process. So essentially you have a cause, you have the regularizer, and then you add an extra regularizer that takes into account an error between what the data-driven model is performing, is predicting, and your proxy is actually doing. So the proxy can be your model, your physical model, your physical constraint, or whatever. And the first approach was presented in that paper on the left. And they tried to predict the different temperatures at the different layers in lakes. And for that, they knew that there is a relationship between the density and the temperature as you move deeper and deeper. And that's the function that they wanted to incorporate as an extra regularizer in the model. On the right hand side, you can see our generalization of that particular formulation, in which we replace this MSE, this L2 norm, with a independence criterion based on kernels. So we can scale up this problem to consider multiple constraints and not to talk about L2 error, but about higher order dependencies between the physical model and the machine learning model. So this is what we call constraint optimization, okay? But there is more. Second approach to combine machine learning and physical models is to define the relationship explicitly in the algorithm, so inside the algorithm itself. No? In this case, we formulated a new Gaussian process model that combines two terms. One term is dedicated to observational data, and the other term is dedicated to simulations from an RTM model. The machine learning model, this new joint GP, we call it, learns not only a predictive model, of course, but also the relative relevance of each term, and tries to compensate for the lack of in situ measurements and tries to fill in the space with simulated data. So we applied this to parameter retrieval, again, of lever index, and for that we used Landsat data, Landsat observations. And for the simulations, we ran the ProSail gravity transfer model over different regions. You can see here Spain, Italy, and Greece. And we obtained good accuracy and consistency between the models and the data, except for some cases. And the reason was that the protocol for measuring things was not actually well observed. And that basically originated a good bunch of problems and inconsistencies between the observational data and the simulations. But we could at least identify that and produce confidence intervals for the predictions too. Well, and the field is actually becoming quite mature, and there are examples that try to encode this prior knowledge inside the machine learning model in a very complicated way, but very efficient in the end. We have recently, well, a couple of years ago already, published this paper about the role and challenges in deep learning and how to integrate process understanding with machine learning, or deep learning in particular. On the left-hand side, we'll show you a couple of examples. On the left-hand side here, you have a general framework to physicize deep learning models by basically including constraints in the network layers. While on the right-hand side, you see an example, an explicit example of a deep learning model that can learn the motion fields that are actually physically consistent. So basically, at the last layer, a warping function coming from a physical model, accounting for the physical rules governing the motion fields, is incorporated there and try to warp out the solution. And this is, again, fed back to the input data. And then these two things, this data-driven architecture, the parameters of the neural network, plus the parameters of the physical model, are learned end-to-end, which is a great advantage as well here. So you learn both things, the data-driven model for doing predictions and some physics, some parameters characterizing the physical model. And another thing, let's say, place where machine learning and physics interplay, it is that of emulation of complex codes. Well, this is called emulation or surrogate modeling. So again, you gain not only speed, but also mathematical tractability, because you replace the RTM, let's say, or the complex code, physical code that you have implemented over the decades. And then you replace it with a machine learning model, and then you can, for free, you can derive sensitivity analysis and also retrieve confidence intervals for the predictions too. And also, of course, the gain in speed is brutal. Well, I will skip this one, but there is a huge field nowadays in which the people is trying to encode ordinary differential equations and partial differential equations into deep learning algorithms, and you can learn both again. Two things: the model and the parameterization of these ODEs, PDEs, and this is called probability hybrid modeling approach. And finally, let's talk a little bit about understanding. And understanding in machine learning model has not like a very nice cartoon. So you get all your data that you have, and you want to retrieve some knowledge. And the knowledge is basically an abstraction. So there is no like a formal definition of what is that. What is that? Well, the knowledge or the understanding can come in different ways, but most typically it should come in a graphical model or a feature ranking or things like that. So the first or the, let's say in older times, we had filters and wrappers in order to retrieve like the most important features out of the model, out of the data set. So this field still is in there, and it has evolved quite a lot. But in the end, something is missing. Something is missing because either you have, of course, you have to define your criterion, what is important, what is not, and of course you can never check if that is right. And in recent years, there's a field more concerned about interpreting what the deep learning architectures or models or machine learning models in general have learned, are doing once that they are trained. And this field is called explainable AI, so SHAI. And nowadays there are tons and tons of methods and approaches to scrutinize a trained neural network. But they can be mainly grouped in three main families: model decomposition, sensitivity analysis, and activation visualization. So let's take a look at some of them. Base visualization is something like this. So you just have to take your training model, and go layer by layer, visualizing what are the activation functions and try to group them together. So you do clustering, for instance, or you do like interventional analysis of your features. So try to change the input stimuli and see what happens in the information bottleneck, in the hierarchical structure of the neural network, etc. On the right-hand side, for example, we have used a particular explainable AI technique in order to see a deep neural network that was trained for predicting crop yield. And we were able to identify which were the times and the scales that were really popping up, which are the most important scales for doing the prediction, the forecasting of the crop yield. And there is another field, of course, that's what it is called imitation or model distillation. Basically, you try to do a kind of surrogate model of your super big fat neural network with a simpler model, let's say a random forest or a decision tree or even a linear regression model. So this way, this surrogate model can try to explain what the more complicated model is actually doing. And there's a huge family of methods in there how to do things properly. But this is actually nothing. This is just looking at your data, and looking at the model that you used in order to do regression or classification with your data. But nothing fundamental is learned. No cause-effect relationships are learned after all. Well, I think that the most important field nowadays is that of graphical models and causal discovery from observational data. And I would like to say some words about this and a particular model that we have been developing. Okay, so why causal discovery is important? Well, essentially because it will allow you to pass from that particular ranking of features, which is kind of okay, but it is limited, to something like on the figure left bottom, in which you learn the cause-effect relationships. Also, you learn when, how, and are they interacting. And also, they allow you to do three main important things in science: hypothesis testing, model and data comparison, and then the third one in climate science is trying to explore or to learn which are the causes of extreme events, for instance, or the extreme impacts. So a nonlinear Gaussian, Granger causality inference method was developed in last years. Essentially, we want to jump from correlation to causation through basically predictability, as Granger causality was actually proposing. Here we focus on this framework of Granger causality, and essentially that tells you you have to test whether the past of X is useful to predict the future Y and all the other variables available. So one fits two models, one decides that X causes Y if and only if the error of the first model is lower than the second one. So traditionally, two main caveats, two main shortcomings. The first one is that typically one uses linear models, and the second one is that one typically uses as a conditional test a linear model too, a linear test too. So we wanted to change that, and for that we used for both kernel methods. We developed kernel regression, replacing the linear regression, and then we tackled the problem of condition independent tests with kernels too. The trick for doing that. We apply it to nonlinear methods. Our nonlinear method to the relationship that we saw before between soul moisture and ENSO. And well, we identify these patterns again, but now with a lower, let's say, causal relationship, other than this high and outstanding correlation that we already observed when we analyze things linearly and with correlation measures only. For example, here, this kernel Granger method revealed interesting patterns of wet and dry causal impacts of ENSO. For example, in Eastern Australia and the tropics, you can see there the relationships that are actually causal, not just correlation explainable, and as well as in regions in China and also Northern Europe too, right? Well, just to facilitate the thing of causal discovery, I just wanted to promote the field with this platform that we are developing in our lab. This platform basically allows you to upload data sets with ground truth and then to check if your causal model is right or not. And we are, of course, introducing more commodity, more practicalities in this platform to do things automatically and for visualization of the graphical models, etc. Well, and just to end up with a bunch of conclusions, I think it is two things. So essentially, machine learning is there for helping us in our observational data analysis. It's a huge opportunity that we cannot discard. It can deal with multivariate data, with multi-source data. It can handle structural and non-structured data, account for non-linearities, for non-causality, but also there are some risks and some remedies as well. Okay, so explainable AI, automatic machine learning, causal inference, physics-driven, physics-guided, physics-aware machine learning are like the three main topics that we will see in the near future. And finally, I would like to thank my colleagues in the lab. Without them, there is actually nothing. There's a fabulous group of people working very hard, and I'm indebted to their work, of course, summarized here in these slides. And just some propaganda. I'm looking not just for 2 people, but for 10 PhDs and postdocs. So you can apply if you want in this particular web page that you can see here. So thank you very much